There is a kind of person who walks through life differently. Not louder, not colder, but somehow untouched. They don't chase approval. They don't crumble under pressure. And when everything falls apart, they don't panic. They rebuild. Quietly. Methodically. Almost instinctively. But here's the unsettling question. What if this strength didn't come from confidence, but from necessity? What if independence is not just a personality trait, but a psychological adaptation? In modern psychology, independence is often praised as a sign of maturity and strength. Yet research from developmental psychology suggests something deeper. Studies on attachment theory, particularly those expanding on the work of John Bowlby, reveal that individuals who become highly self-reliant often learn early in life that relying on others was unreliable, inconsistent, or even unsafe. This doesn't mean something went wrong. It means something powerful was built. Fierce independence is not just about doing things alone. It's about trusting yourself more than anyone else. It's about internal stability in a world that often feels uncertain. And paradoxically, it can be both a superpower and a silent burden. The first psychological sign of a fiercely independent person is this: they instinctively solve problems alone, even when help is available. Not because they want to suffer. Not because they enjoy struggle. But because somewhere deep inside, asking for help doesn't feel natural. Neuroscience gives us insight into this behavior. When individuals repeatedly rely on themselves to overcome challenges, their brain strengthens neural pathways associated with self-efficacy. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. The brain begins to associate doing it alone with safety and control. This is why fiercely independent people often feel uneasy when others step in. Help can feel intrusive. It can feel like a loss of control. And here's the part most people don't understand. It's not arrogance. It's conditioning. In social psychology, this pattern is sometimes linked to what researchers call defensive self-reliance. It develops when a person learns that depending on others leads to disappointment or vulnerability. So instead, they adapt. They become the solution. You might recognize this in subtle ways. You hesitate before asking for support. You replay scenarios in your head before reaching out. You would rather spend hours figuring something out yourself than risk being misunderstood. And when you do succeed, there's a quiet satisfaction. Not just pride. Relief. Because deep down, it confirms something you've believed for a long time. I can handle this. On my own. But this raises a deeper question. If independence is built on self-trust, where did that trust begin? Some studies suggest that individuals who experienced early unpredictability develop heightened internal control systems. In simple terms, when the external world feels unstable, the brain compensates by strengthening internal stability. This is not weakness. It is adaptation at its most sophisticated level. However, there is a cost. Fiercely independent people often carry invisible fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but cognitive load. The constant awareness that everything depends on you. Every decision. Every outcome. Every failure. And yet, they rarely complain. Because complaining would mean admitting they need something. And needing something feels unfamiliar. So they continue. Quietly strong. Quietly tired. This is the paradox of fierce independence. The very trait that makes you resilient can also isolate you. And the world will praise you for it, without ever asking what it cost you to become this way. The real question is not whether independence is good or bad. The real question is, at what point does strength become self-protection? And at what point does self-protection become a barrier? Because the line between power and isolation is thinner than most people realize. And this is only the beginning. There is a moment most people don't notice. A moment so subtle, it passes without recognition. Someone asks how you're doing. You pause for half a second, and then you say, "I'm fine." Not because you're fine, but because explaining feels unnecessary. Maybe even uncomfortable. This is the second psychological sign of fierce independence: emotional self-sufficiency. It doesn't mean you don't feel deeply. In fact, the opposite is often true. You feel everything. You process everything. But you do it internally, privately, and with remarkable control. To the outside world, you appear calm, grounded, unshaken. But internally, there is constant processing happening beneath the surface. Psychological research on emotional regulation shows that highly independent individuals tend to rely heavily on what is called intrapersonal regulation. Instead of co-regulating emotions with others, which is the natural human tendency, they regulate themselves. They analyze their own thoughts. They calm their own anxiety. They carry their own emotional weight. Over time, this becomes automatic. And here's where it becomes powerful, and dangerous at the same time. Because when you become too good at handling everything internally, you stop reaching outward. You don't vent. You don't lean. You don't open up easily. Not because you don't want connection, but because you've trained yourself to survive without it. Studies in social neuroscience suggest that humans are wired for emotional sharing. When we express vulnerability, the brain releases oxytocin, strengthening trust and connection. But fiercely independent individuals often bypass this process. They don't seek that release. They endure instead. And endurance becomes identity. You might recognize this pattern in your own life. You go through something difficult, but you don't tell anyone. You convince yourself it's not necessary. You say things like, "I'll deal with it." And you do. You always do. But something subtle begins to happen. Your inner world becomes richer, but also more isolated. And people around you start to misunderstand you. They think you don't need support. They think you're always okay. They think you're strong all the time. So they stop asking. And you never correct them. This creates what psychologists sometimes describe as an invisible wall. Not a barrier built from rejection, but from self-containment. From the outside, everything looks open. You're friendly. You're capable. You're present. But emotionally, there are layers that very few people ever reach. And here's the paradox. Fiercely independent people often crave deep connection. Not superficial conversation. Not casual interaction. But real, honest, unfiltered understanding. Yet at the same time, they struggle to create it. Because creating that level of connection requires vulnerability. And vulnerability requires trust. And trust, for someone who has learned to rely only on themselves, is not given easily. So instead they wait. They wait for someone who understands without needing explanation. Someone who sees beyond the surface. Someone who doesn't require them to break down their walls, but somehow walks through them naturally. And until that person appears, they remain self-contained. Functional. Strong. Independent. But quietly, alone in ways that are difficult to explain. There's also a cognitive aspect to this. Research in cognitive psychology shows that individuals who habitually process emotions internally develop strong metacognition. They become highly aware of their own thinking patterns. They reflect deeply. They analyze situations from multiple perspectives. This makes them incredibly resilient. But it also means they rarely feel understood. Because they've already thought through everything before anyone else even hears about it. So when someone offers advice, it often feels redundant. When someone tries to help, it can feel unnecessary. And when someone tries to connect emotionally, it can feel slightly out of sync. Not wrong. Just not quite aligned. This is why fiercely independent people often say very little about what they're going through. Not because they lack words, but because they've already had the conversation, internally. And yet there is something missing. Because no matter how strong self-regulation becomes, it cannot fully replace shared experience. The human brain evolved for connection, not just survival. So the question becomes deeper now. If you can handle everything on your own, who do you allow to stand beside you? And more importantly, do you still remember how to let them in? This is where independence begins to transform. From strength into something more complex. There is a quiet tension that lives inside fiercely independent people. It doesn't show up in obvious ways. It doesn't look like fear in the traditional sense. Instead, it appears as preference. I just prefer to do things myself. I don't like relying on others. I feel more comfortable when I'm in control. These statements sound rational, even admirable. But beneath them lies the third psychological sign of fierce independence, a deep discomfort with dependence. Not weakness, not insecurity, but a learned resistance to needing others. To understand this, we have to look at how the brain interprets control. In cognitive psychology, control is closely tied to perceived safety. When you feel in control, your brain reduces threat signals. Stress decreases. Decision-making becomes clearer. But when control is uncertain, the brain activates caution. It scans for risk. It prepares for disappointment. For fiercely independent individuals, control is not just a preference. It is a stabilizing force. Because at some point in life, control may have been the only reliable thing they had. So they learn to hold on to it tightly. This is why dependence feels different for them. It doesn't feel neutral. It feels like exposure. When you depend on someone, you introduce variables you cannot control. Their choices, their reliability, their presence, their absence. And for someone who has built their identity around self-reliance, that uncertainty can feel deeply uncomfortable. Not because they don't trust people, but because they trust themselves more. This creates a subtle but powerful pattern. They avoid situations where they might need others. They minimize reliance in relationships. They structure their lives in ways that reduce vulnerability. And from the outside, it looks like strength. But internally, it is also protection. There is research in behavioral psychology that supports this pattern. Studies on avoidant coping mechanisms show that individuals who prioritize independence often develop strategies to reduce emotional reliance on others. This is not avoidance in the sense of running away. It is avoidance in the sense of preemptive self-sufficiency. They don't wait to be disappointed. They eliminate the possibility. You might notice this in small decisions. You hesitate to delegate tasks, even when overwhelmed. You prefer to manage everything yourself, even if it takes longer. You feel uneasy when someone offers to take responsibility, because it means you have to trust them. And trust, for you, is not casual. It is calculated. Earned slowly. Given carefully. And once broken, rarely restored to the same level. But here's where the deeper layer emerges. Fiercely independent people are not incapable of connection. In fact, when they do trust someone, the bond is often profound. Loyal. Deep. Unshakable. Because they don't trust easily, when they do, it carries weight. However, getting to that point requires something that challenges their core instinct. Letting go of control. And that is not easy. Because letting go means accepting uncertainty. It means accepting that outcomes are no longer entirely in your hands. It means accepting that someone else has influence over your emotional state. And that is where the internal conflict begins. Part of you wants connection. Part of you resists the vulnerability it requires. So you stand in between. Strong enough to stand alone. But not always willing to lean. This is the paradox that defines this stage of independence. You are capable of building everything on your own. But the question is, do you allow anyone to build with you? Because there is a difference between independence and isolation. Independence is the ability to stand alone. Isolation is the inability to stand with others. And the line between the two is not always visible. It is shaped by trust, by experience, by what you've learned about people, and what you've learned about yourself. But something important begins to shift when you recognize this pattern. Because awareness introduces choice. And choice introduces change. You begin to realize that control is not the only path to safety. That trust, when placed carefully, does not weaken you. It expands you. But this realization doesn't happen instantly. It unfolds slowly. Through experiences. Through relationships. Through moments where you take small risks and discover that not everything falls apart. And in those moments, something new begins to form. A different kind of strength. one that is not built solely on independence, but on the ability to balance independence with connection. And that leads to the final and perhaps most revealing sign of all. There is something people notice about you, even if they can't quite explain it. You don't tolerate nonsense. You don't stay where you're not respected. You don't chase people who are inconsistent. And you don't lower your standards just to avoid being alone. To some, this looks intimidating. To others, it looks cold. But in reality, it reveals the fourth and fifth psychological signs of fierce independence: exceptionally high internal standards, and a low tolerance for anything that disrupts your sense of self. This is where independence becomes unmistakable. Because it's no longer just about how you function alone. It's about how you choose what you allow into your life. In psychology, this is closely tied to self-concept clarity. Research shows that individuals with a strong, stable sense of self are less likely to compromise their values for social approval. They don't adjust their identity to fit environments. They select environments that align with who they already are. And that changes everything. You begin to see relationships differently. Not as something you need, but as something you evaluate. You pay attention to consistency, to emotional maturity, to reliability. Not because you are overly critical, but because you have learned the cost of instability. You have experienced what it feels like to carry everything on your own. And once you know that weight, you become very selective about who you allow to share that space. This is why your circle tends to be small. Not because you can't connect with people, but because very few people meet the level of depth, integrity, and understanding you require. And you are okay with that. In fact, studies in personality psychology suggest that highly independent individuals often prefer quality over quantity in relationships. They derive more satisfaction from a few meaningful connections than from broad social networks. This is not antisocial behavior. It is intentional filtering. But there is another layer here. Because having high standards is not just about others. It is also about yourself. Fiercely independent people often hold themselves to expectations that are just as demanding, if not more. They expect themselves to be capable, resilient, composed. They push themselves to grow, to improve, to handle more than most people would attempt. And they rarely give themselves permission to fail openly. This creates a quiet internal pressure. Because when your identity is built on strength, showing weakness can feel like contradiction. So instead you adapt. You improve. You adjust. You keep moving forward. And from the outside, it looks effortless. But internally, there is constant refinement happening. You are always calibrating your standards. Always evaluating your decisions. Always asking yourself if you could have done better. This is what makes you powerful. But it is also what can make you unforgiving toward yourself. And here is the final realization. Fierce independence is not just about being strong enough to stand alone. It is about being strong enough to choose when you don't have to. Because true independence is not isolation. It is freedom. Freedom to walk away from what doesn't serve you. Freedom to build a life on your own terms. Freedom to choose connection, not out of need, but out of genuine desire. And that is where everything comes full circle. Because the strongest individuals are not the ones who never rely on others. They are the ones who can, and still remain whole. They are the ones who can open up without losing themselves. Who can trust without surrendering control completely. Who can connect without compromising their identity. That is not weakness. That is evolution. So if you recognize these signs within yourself, understand this. You didn't become this way by accident. You became this way through adaptation, through experience, through learning how to navigate a world that doesn't always offer stability. And while that journey may have required you to build strength in solitude, it does not mean you are meant to stay there forever. Because independence is not the destination. It is the foundation. And what you choose to build on top of it. That is where your real life begins.